Close your eyes. Falling asleep has never been this easy. And I am taking you far, far away, into the depths. Take a deep breath. Now imagine a desert stretching out like eternity. Yellow, dry, and silent. The sky has turned orange. The sun is slowly setting. Everywhere is sand. But in the midst of that silence, there is a thin line, barely discernible to the eye. As if someone took their brush and drew a blue line through the middle of the desert. That is it, the Nile River. Everything started with it. There was no war, no sword, only water, only patience. The Nile's floods turned arid land into fertility. People began to gather around it. The black mud left behind by the receding water yielded the first crops. Wheat sprouted, people settled, houses were built, and a civilization was quietly born. The Nile was not just a river. It was a sacred entity that measured time and shaped life. It flooded at certain times each year, then quietly receded. People set their calendars by it. They built their gods around it. The voice of the Nile was their prayer. When it fell silent, people were afraid. When it flooded, they danced with joy. And this new civilization grew. Over time, villages became cities. Cities turned into kingdoms. Pyramids rose. Stones found a voice. Every structure was an echo of the Nile. And every night, people looked at the stars and gave thanks. Because they knew. In the morning, the Nile would flow again. Which meant life would continue. Now you, close your eyes. Feel a cool breeze on your forehead on the banks of the Nile. A sistrum is playing in the distance. The scent of incense wafts from a temple. Everything is calm, everything is ancient. Before you fall asleep, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because this is not just a story. This is the sleep of civilization. Pleasant dreams. Around 5000 BC, in the lands of today's Egypt, people lived as nomads. But one day, it wasn't a great stone that came, but a patiently flowing water that formed the heart of civilization. When the Nile River flooded each year, it left behind a black and fertile mud. From this mud emerged wheat, emerged barley, and humanity settled down for the first time. This is why the ancient Egyptians called their country Kemet, meaning the Black Lands. For them, this blackness was not death, but life itself. Because drought was yellow, barren. But the mud left by the Nile was life. Every village built on this land eventually turned into a city, and these cities would one day form the oldest kingdom in history. The Egyptians, like other peoples around them, listened not only to nature but also to the rhythm of time. The Nile's flooding time determined the calendar. The cycle of the sun determined the days and seasons. Thus, not only farming but also mathematics, engineering, and writing developed. They began to speak with symbols called hieroglyphs. These symbols were not a nail, but a poem. Each one told a life. But to protect this order, one more thing was needed. A belief. The Egyptians believed in gods who kept everything in order. Ra, who gave birth to the sun, Osiris, who judged the dead, Isis, symbolizing fertility, and above all, a leader who sustained this order on earth. The pharaoh. He was not just a king, but the representative of the gods. This is why the pyramids were not just tombs, but an expression of immortality. And so began the journey of ancient Egypt. Not with a conquest or revolution, but quietly, patiently, with the rhythm of the Nile, this civilization rising from the sands would guide the world for hundreds of years, erect stone buildings to the sky, and see even death as a transition. Everything began with the patience of a river. In the beginning, Egypt was not a single country. In the north was Lower Egypt, in the Nile Delta. In the south was Upper Egypt, near the source of the Nile. Lower Egypt was represented by the green crown, Upper Egypt by the white crown. The two kingdoms lived on the same river but did not trust each other. They were nourished by the same source but worshipped different gods, sanctified different kings. These were two separate stories of the same Nile. Until a man emerged. Narmer. Some sources write his name as Menes, but for those who leave a mark throughout history, the name is not important. The mark is. Narmer united the two crowns. Now the pharaoh represented both Upper and Lower Egypt. On his head were both the white and green crowns. From that day on, the two banks of the Nile began to beat like a single heart. With this unification, The concept of unity was born in Egypt for the first time. Now the gods were also at peace. As symbols, the papyrus, the plant of Lower Egypt, and the lotus, the flower of Upper Egypt, began to be drawn side by side. Kings were both warriors and mediators, and thus around 300 BC, the first dynasty was established. The Old Kingdom period of ancient Egypt had begun. The order established by Narmer was not just a political union but a cultural fusion. The people were now united under one flag. The first great structures built were not just displays of power, but symbols of this unity. Every stone, every relief was now the voice of a single civilization, not two separate countries. Narmer, the oldest documented king in history, was the king of Upper Egypt around 3100 BC. But his eyes were on the north. One morning, he gathered his army and marched to Lower Egypt. There was no war. There was no great slaughter. Because Narmer was not a commander, but a unifier. And one day, they saw him with two crowns on his head, white and green. This was not just a kingdom, it was the union of two worlds. The harshness of the south with the fertility of the north, the union of stone and soil, sword and prayers, gods and people. At that moment, for the first time in history, Egypt became a whole. Narmer's name still holds its place in the oldest living historical document, the stone tablet called the Narmer Palette. This stone tells not just the power of a king, but the beginning of a civilization. It doesn't just contain drawings. It has the voice of an era. It tells how two enemies became one heart, how even the gods reconciled. And so the first dynasty began. Now every new king carried Narmer's legacy. In the shadow of every pyramid, his name was whispered. Because Egypt's history began to be written not with a commander, but with the silent victory of a unifying king. After unity was achieved, dynasties followed one after another in Egypt. Kings were now not just rulers, but guardians of order. But especially with the third dynasty, something changed. Kings were no longer just kings. They were declared gods. They became the breath of the gods on earth, the representatives of immortality. Do you know who the most remarkable king of this period was? Djoser. But what made Djoser's story unforgettable was a man who walked quietly beside him. Imhotep, a vizier, an architect, a doctor, a seer. A genius far ahead of his time. He did not build a tomb for his king, he built a monument, and the first great stone structure in history was born. The Step Pyramid at Saqqara. This structure was not just a tomb. It was a staircase reaching to the gods. Because the Egyptians believed that death was merely a transformation, and that staircase was the wish of a mortal king to ascend to heaven. The subsequent fourth dynasty stepped not only to the peak of Egypt but of human history. The kings of this period carved immortality into stone. Khufu erected the world's largest pyramid in the Giza Desert. Around 2580 BC. Millions of stone blocks, tons of weight, no cranes, no wheels. But this structure still stands. How it was built is not fully known even today. Perhaps the secret was not in the stone but in believing hands. After Khufu came Khafre and Menkaure. They too built their own pyramids, and before the pyramids, a being was erected that has been silently watching for thousands of years. The Great Sphinx, half human, half lion. It neither speaks nor moves, but its eyes always look into the distance. Like a sage who has swallowed the secrets of the past and chosen to remain silent. But no golden age lasts forever. Kings multiplied, dynasties intermingled, power fragmented. Governors, nomarchs, began to rule their regions like divine rulers. There was no longer a single center. Fragmented cities, people turned inward, silenced gods, and finally, the central authority collapsed. For the first time, Egypt turned inward. The temples that once spoke with the gods were silent. The shadow of the pyramids now carried not peace but loneliness, and the Nile, with its annual secrets, began to flow again like just a river. When the Old Kingdom collapsed, Egypt was plunged into silence. From 2181 BC, for a full 200 years, there was a silence in the heart of the country. No new pyramids were erected, nor were great ceremonies held in the name of the gods. The pharaohs still existed, perhaps, but they were now just memories carved on stone walls. In reality, those who ruled the country were now the provincial governors, the nomarchs. Each acted like a king in their own land. ruling the people, making their own decisions. The pharaoh was like a legend beyond the Nile, and Egypt was once again divided into north and south. The crown, once a symbol of unity, was now a silent memory of separation. The people were miserable. The Nile sometimes didn't flood at all. Drought came. Sometimes it flooded too much. Floods came. The harvest was gone. The land became infertile. Famine spread, and for the first time, the Egyptians questioned their faith. If the pharaoh is a god, why are we hungry? Why are our children dying? Why have the gods abandoned us? These questions were a breaking point in ancient Egyptian history, because for the first time, a distance formed between the gods and the people. Now holiness was expected from the earth, not from the sky. A new order was needed for these lands to be fertile again, and this order would be born from an unexpected place. Around 2050 BC, Thebes in the south, today's Luxor, became a gate opening from dark days to light. A king emerged from this city, Mentuhotep II. But he was not just a ruler. He was a savior who brought hope to a nation weary from civil war. After years of division, he marched his army north. Lower Egypt was reconquered, and the two crowns were once again united on a single head. But this time, it was beyond a symbolic union. It was also a union between the people and the king, and thus the Middle Kingdom period began. But this period was very different from the Old Kingdom. Pharaohs were no longer inaccessible gods, but leaders close to the people. Palaces were simpler, words more meaningful. The goal of the kings was no longer just to serve the gods, but to keep the people standing. Art also changed. Statues were no longer cold and flawless, but human. Faces had wrinkles. On the walls, the stories of ordinary people were written. And for the first time, yes, for the first time, inscriptions were placed in the tombs of farmers, artisans, and mothers, alongside the tombs of the pharaohs. It turned out that life was not just for the pharaohs. One of the most important concepts in the Middle Kingdom was marat. Balance, justice, universal order. Kings now not only ruled but strived to maintain balance. Dams were built. Irrigation systems were expanded. Mines were opened. The heart of the economy beat again. For the first time, the people felt what peace truly meant. But every peace lasts only until ashore. On the eastern border, a community was quietly gathering strength. The Hyksos were like a shadow, their eyes fixed on the Nile, patiently waiting, and they were the harbingers of a new period in which Egypt would be dragged into collapse once again. Around 1700 BC, the sky changed in the north. A wind from afar carried foreign sounds to the waters of the Nile, and finally, the Hyksos entered through the eastern gate. They were a people, perhaps, but what they truly brought was change. Who were the Hyksos? Most likely an Asiatic tribe from the lands of today's Palestine, Syria. But they were not just people. They were technology. When they set foot in Egypt, they brought with them a brand new war order. Wheeled chariots, sharp swords forged from bronze, fast units equipped with horses, and powerful long-range bows. Egypt was still tied to its old traditions. Soldiers carried spears. Wars were fought step by step. But the Hyksos came like the wind, and one morning they entered Avaris, the heart of the delta. The city was silent. There was no resistance, because no one was prepared for such a force. Lower Egypt fell into the hands of the Hyksos. But strangely, they did not touch Thebes in the south. It was as if a silent agreement had been made between the gods of the north and the gods of the south. Thus, Egypt was once again divided in two. But this time it was different, because one half of the country was now under the shadow of an invader. And Thebes, that old capital, had not lost its pride. Priests plotting inwardly, princes growing patiently, and a people with their eyes fixed on the north were waiting. Because history had shown, Egypt may fall, but it does not surrender. But this time, the south did not remain silent, because there was a child, still young, but inside him grew the honor of a great nation. Seqenenretau, the king of Thebes, declared war on the Hyksos. Did he win? No, but some victories are written not by winning, but by resisting. When his corpse was found, his skull was shattered by an axe. But as that head fell to the ground, the seed of a new resistance had already been sown. His son Kamos took over the war. Walls, sieges, night raids, but the occupation still continued. And one day, Kamos died. A child replaced him. Ahmose. Ahmose grew up and one day launched a great offensive against the Hyksos. He marched to the delta. He besieged Avaris, and that day, he erased the black stain from Egypt's brow. The Hyksos were expelled. But more importantly, the Egyptians learned how to fight. They were no longer just defenders. Now the pharaohs were conquering leaders, and thus history began to write the New Kingdom period. This period would be one of the most powerful, richest, and most impressive eras of ancient Egypt. Because now in Egypt, there were not only gods. There were armies, conquests, and the shadow of kings. And those ancient lands on the banks of the Nile were now preparing to shape not only their own children but also the outside world. When Ahmose expelled the Hyksos from the country, the calendars showed 1550 BC. But this was not just an end, but also a brand new beginning. Because with him, one of the most glorious periods in history was beginning. The New Kingdom period. This period would be remembered not only with pyramids but with armies, conquests, gold, victory, and legends. And the most interesting thing is that one of the most extraordinary characters in this most powerful age of ancient Egypt was a woman. But those who saw her wouldn't realize she was a woman at first glance. Because she dressed like a man, wore a false beard, and used the title of pharaoh. Her name was Hatshepsut. She was the wife of a pharaoh, then a widowed queen. Normally, she would be expected to remain in the quiet corners of the palace, but she heard not the whisper of fate, but her throne. The male heir was still young, and Hatshepsut stepped onto the stage to fill this gap. As one of the first great female leaders in history, she declared herself the chosen one of the god Ammonius. She was not a commander, nor was she a warrior, but her battlefield was different. Economy, art, and architecture. During her period, Egypt grew without war. She built luxurious temples, organized trade fleets. She organized expeditions to distant lands, as far as the coasts of today's Somalia. Gold, incense, precious woods, ivory. Hatshepsut's Egypt was woven with wealth and peace, and even today, that magnificent temple at Deir el-Bahari stands tall against the desert winds as a silent witness to her vision. But as time progressed, the shadows over the throne began to grow. When the new king Akhenaten took the stage, he changed the rhythm of ancient Egypt. He was not just a king, but a revolutionary, a reformer, and perhaps a heretic. Because Akhenaten destroyed the belief system of Egypt, thousands of years old. He opposed the polytheistic religion. Ammonius, Osiris, Isis, he rejected them all. He recognized only one god, Aten, the halo of light representing the sun, and he declared himself its sole representative. He moved his capital from Thebes. He built a city called Akhetaten, meaning the horizon of Aten, in the place of today's Tel El Amarna, and ordered the whole country. Forget the old gods, close the old temples, silence the priests. But he was not alone in this radical transformation. Beside him was one of the most beautiful women in history. Nefertiti, her name means, the beautiful one has come, and she truly was. Not only with her physical beauty, but with her strong stance and impressive intelligence, she was Akhenaten's greatest supporter. In this new period, even art changed. Statues were more realistic. Kings were no longer just idealized gods. They were sad, weak, thoughtful people. Even a king holding his child in his arms was now drawn on the walls. But the people did not embrace this change. Because the gods were not just a belief, but also a tradition, and tradition is not easily destroyed. With Akhenaten's death, this monotheistic revolution also collapsed, and the throne was taken over by a child of only 9 years old, Tutankhamun. His life was short. He lived only until 18. But his fate was so great that no one remained who did not know his name. Because his tomb was one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. When it was opened by Howard Carter in 1922, the world held its breath. Inside was a coffin made of gold, a magnificent death mask, furniture, chariots, and a magic still unspoiled. Tutankhamun may have been an ordinary king, but after his death, he became the immortal face of ancient Egypt. With its mystery, its curse, and its dazzling wealth. The New Kingdom period reached the pinnacle of splendor with one man, Ramses II. They called him not just a king, but Ramses the Great. Because he remained on the throne for 66 years, and throughout those years, he did not just rule. He wrote, carved, engraved, and built. Ramses marched north with his armies and immortalized his name with one of the most famous battles in history, the Battle of Kadesh. This battle with the Hittites may not have been won, but a first occurred. The first known written peace treaty in history. Ramses was both a warrior and a diplomat. Some remember another different feature of his. The Pharaoh of Moses. The period of Ramses almost exactly overlaps with the Pharaoh figure in the story of captivity and exodus told in the Torah. The Red Sea, palaces, slavery, and the stubbornness in the Pharaoh's heart. Historians do not speak definitively, but the people always remember him this way. Ramses had his name written on temples. The Abu Simbel temple proclaims his divinity with 4 colossal statues. He was the last great pharaoh. Those who came after him sat on the throne but remained in the shadow. Because after Ramses, there were only humans. There were no god-kings. The new kingdom gradually dissolved. Priests became as powerful as kings. Libyan princes came. Then the Nubians, and then the iron fist of Assyria fell. And finally, in 332 BC, a young king from another corner of the world emerged. Alexander the Great. The Egyptians welcomed him not as an enemy but as a liberator. Because he entered Egypt not with conquest but with respect, and declared himself the son of the god Ammonius. The Ptolemaic dynasty was a Greek-origin dynasty established in Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. But the land they ruled was still the country of gods and pharaohs. Therefore, the Ptolemaic kings ruled with Greek minds but dressed like Egyptians. They spoke in the name of the gods but paid taxes to Rome. Because in that period, the real power was no longer on the banks of the Nile but on the banks of the Tiber River. And in that time of decline, in 69 BC, a baby was born in the Alexandria palace. No one recognized him at the moment of his birth, but one day the whole world would learn his name. Cleopatra 7 Philopator, meaning the goddess beloved by her father. Ironic, because throughout history, this girl would grow not with love but with intelligence to survive. It is not known for certain who her mother was. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was a weak king tightly bound by loyalty to Rome. Misery increased under his rule. The people revolted. Intra-dynasty quarrels grew. Cleopatra was surrounded by palace intrigues as a child. Everyone was ready to sell out the other to get close to the throne. This taught Cleopatra a single lesson at a very young age. To survive, you either play the game or become the victim. The Alexandria palace was no longer a school. It was a battlefield. But Cleopatra was different. She knew 7 languages. She spoke philosophy, politics, and rhetoric better than Roman diplomats. And most importantly, she was the first Ptolemaic leader to speak the language of the people, the Egyptian language. This would make her not just a princess, but a true leader. Because Cleopatra's childhood passed in the shadow of a decline. But her eyes saw not only the darkness but also the light at the edge of the throne. She would become the last queen of a country. But at the same time, she would become the last breath of ancient Egypt, one of the most powerful female names in history. The Roman Empire was growing towards the east. Egypt was both an ally and prey of Rome. Cleopatra was born in just such an age. In an age where a woman would write history while an empire was falling. She was not just a queen. She was a war of intelligence, a strategy plan, a fire of passion. Her story was the beginning not only of Egypt's but of Rome's, the world's, and today's understanding of female leadership. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was known among the people as elites, meaning the flute player king. Because instead of governing the state, he played the flute, drank wine in the palace, and organized entertainments. He had no authority. While his people were wretched, he spent time with musicians in gold-leafed halls. But his main problem was not drink or music. He owed a throne that didn't even belong to him to Rome's loyalty. Rome had become the master of the Mediterranean at that time, and Egypt was no longer an ancient civilization but a client state indebted to Rome. Ptolemy XII gave bribes to Rome to protect his throne. He emptied the country's treasury and was therefore hated among the people. Rebellions increased. The streets of Alexandria became chaotic. The king had to take refuge in Rome for a while. It was in such an atmosphere of ruin that Cleopatra was raised. But in the palace, she accumulated not gold but an invisible weapon: knowledge. For her, the palace was not a playground but a survival laboratory. She spoke 7 languages. Her oratory was strong. She was versed in both Greek philosophy and Egyptian mythology, and most importantly, she was the first Ptolemy to speak the language of the Egyptian people. The people saw her not as a foreigner but as one of their own. After her father's death, Cleopatra was 18 years old but could not sit on the throne alone. Egyptian laws required the queen to rule together with a man. Therefore, she was married to her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, and declared co-queen officially. But the truth was elsewhere. Her brother was just a puppet. The real power in the palace was in the one person who could make political moves at a young age: in Cleopatra. However, this power did not last long. Palace intrigues began. Cleopatra's advisors were killed, and finally, Cleopatra was exiled from the palace by her brother and his supporters. This was not an end for her. It was only a second birth. Because in exile, a new story would be written not on the banks of the Nile, but in the shadow of Rome. Cleopatra was not Egyptian by blood. Her family was of Macedonian origin. Her ancestors descended from Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals. When Alexander died, his empire was shared, and Ptolemy took the country of the Nile. Thus, a dynasty of Greek origin but seated on the Egyptian throne was born: the Ptolemies. However, the rulers of this dynasty were never fully considered Egyptian. They lived with Greek traditions, building walls between themselves and the people. For hundreds of years, the palaces spoke Greek. Temples were filled with foreign gods. But Cleopatra was the first name to reverse all this. Cleopatra was the first pharaoh to speak the Egyptian language. She mentioned the names of the gods in the language the people understood. She made her offerings in the ancient language of Egypt, not in Greek. The common people saw her for the first time not as a foreigner but as their own pharaoh, and this showed that to win the people's hearts, understanding was sufficient, not gold. But the only thing that made her unforgettable was not the bond she established with the people. Cleopatra was one of the most intelligent leaders of her time. She knew 7 languages. She was educated in astronomy, medicine, politics, and diplomacy. When she spoke, she was effective. Even when she was silent, she attracted attention. For her, beauty was a detail. Her real power was her words. For she was not just a female leader. She was an example proving how a woman could establish power with knowledge throughout history. And that is why she was etched into history not just as a queen, but as the voice of an era, the resistance of a civilization, the immortal memory of a woman. The palace where Cleopatra grew up, though it reflected a magnificence rising with marble columns from the outside, had a constant fishing rod of intrigue inside. Brotherhood here meant not a bond of trust but a potential danger. Because the tradition in the Ptolemaic dynasty was this: siblings marry, sit on the throne together. But in the end, one poisons the other. In the palace, there was not love, but a survival instinct. Cleopatra also grew up in the midst of this chaos. Behind beautiful tapestries, there were whispers. Under the wine served at meals, there was fear. She could trust no one. Because in the Ptolemaic dynasty, even family could be deadly. Behind every smile, there could be a plan. Behind every palace official, there could be a spy, and Cleopatra was aware of these even as a child. When her father, Ptolemy XII, died, the calendars showed 51 BC. He left the throne to his 18-year-old daughter Cleopatra and his 10-year-old son, Ptolemy XIII. Officially, the siblings would rule together. But if there were 2 names on the throne, there was only one real power, and that was Cleopatra. Because she was the only one who could read and write, speak the people's language, manage state documents, and conduct diplomacy. Cleopatra was not content to be just a figure. She balanced the tax system, corresponded with city governors, established friendly relations with foreign countries. She was not just a woman in the palace, she was the brain of an entire state. But it was at this point that the crack between her and her brother deepened. Because for a child, such a powerful older sister meant a threat. And this crack soon turned into a war. Cleopatra was expelled from the palace. The young queen who once sat on the golden throne was now living in a shelter in the desert. But instead of sulking, she made plans. Because Cleopatra saw exile not as an end but only as the beginning of a return. When Cleopatra was sent into exile, it was not just a political move. It was part of a great conspiracy to corner one of the most intelligent female leaders in history. But Cleopatra was never one to accept being cornered. Because in her eyes, every retreat was part of a plan to return. Ptolemy XII's advisor Pothinus and General Achilles had taken full control of the capital. Cleopatra's seals were removed from documents. Her name no longer appeared even in official correspondence. The doors of the treasury were closed to her. Only her enemies remained in the palace corridors. Finally, a decision was made at midnight. Cleopatra would be removed from the palace. Without any ceremony, without any explanation. Just exile. But this was not their victory. It was Cleopatra's silent resistance. She took her most loyal soldiers with her. Cartographers, diplomats, a few advisors who had worked with her for years, and with all of them, she set out not to the south but to the east, towards Syria. That place would be for her not just a shelter but a headquarters. Because Cleopatra was not going to return to the throne, she was going to take it back. During these years of exile, Cleopatra began to watch not her enemies but her opportunities. Pompey was one of the most powerful men in Rome. But he lost against Caesar and sought a safe harbor while fleeing. The place that came to his mind was Egypt. Because Egypt was still loyal to Rome. But at the same time, it was weak, divided, and turbulent with internal conflicts. Just the ground a refugee would need. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors first saw Pompey's arrival as an opportunity. They thought, if we act before Caesar, kill Pompey, we will gain the favor of Rome's new leader, and they did so. When Pompey set foot on land, they pretended to welcome him friendly. But suddenly, a knife from behind. One of the most powerful generals in history was killed by his own allies, and his head was cut off. Then this severed head was presented as a gift to Julius Caesar. But Caesar was angry, because he defeated his enemies on the battlefield. He respected their surrender, not their being killed like a fugitive. It was at this moment that Cleopatra knew her time had come. Because Caesar was now in Egypt, and he felt a deep anger towards the gift presented to him in Ptolemy's palace. Cleopatra would not miss this opportunity. Now the stage was being set for one of the most iconic meetings in history. A queen rolled up in a carpet, presented before Caesar. When Caesar saw Pompey's head, he went mad with anger. He was my enemy. Yes. But to do this to a Roman citizen is unforgivable. And he entered Alexandria. His aim was to bring justice and solve the problem on the Egyptian throne. When Cleopatra heard this in Syria, she smiled. Because the opportunity she had been waiting for years had come. But she was forbidden to enter the palace. So she did something that became a moment etched in history. Cleopatra wrapped herself in a large carpet. 2 men carried her into the palace, to the room where Caesar was staying. When the carpet was unrolled on the floor, Cleopatra unfolded with a swift movement. She smiled and looked into Caesar's eyes. Rome only loves the powerful. I too have things to show you. Caesar was mesmerized. This woman was like no woman he knew in Rome. She was intelligent, determined, elegant, and she was not afraid of him. Quickly, decisions were made in Cleopatra's favor. Ptolemy was enraged, but Caesar suppressed him. Cleopatra returned to the Egyptian throne. She was still married to her brother. Yes. But this time, Rome was behind her. When Cleopatra emerged from the carpet and stood before Julius Caesar, she wrote history not only with her intelligence but also with her political courage. With Caesar's support, she sat on the Egyptian throne again. But traditions were still in effect. She had to share the throne with her brother again. Ptolemy XIII now existed only on paper. In reality, the new ruler of Egypt was Cleopatra. However, the palace was still the old palace. Intrigues had not ended, and Julius Caesar's presence this time disturbed not only the palace but the entire people. Ptolemy and his advisors did not accept this situation. Armed resistance began. Street-by-street fighting broke out between Roman troops and Egyptians. Libraries burned. Palaces collapsed. The people panicked. This went down in history as the Alexandrian War. Cleopatra gave Caesar full authority to defend her throne. Caesar called for reinforcements from Rome, and finally, Ptolemy 13 drowned in the Nile River. Now Cleopatra's path was completely clear, but she could not rule without a brother. Tradition came into play again. This time, she married her other brother, Ptolemy 14. He was only 12 years old, but everyone knew he could not overshadow the queen. The palace fell silent. The people poured into the squares, and Cleopatra sat on the golden throne again. But this time, there was a difference. Beside her was not just a child co-king, but the most powerful man in Rome. The people no longer called her just queen. They greeted her like this, the embodiment of Isis. Because Cleopatra used the goddess cult of Egypt very well. By identifying herself with Isis, she transformed her political power into a religious might. Cleopatra was a friend of Rome, but in fact, she was also directing Rome. Caesar admired her intelligence and granted her special privileges. Tax exemptions, access to Roman trade routes, the right to take sides in the Roman Civil War. But this was not Cleopatra's only move. Because one morning, news came to Caesar's room. Cleopatra was pregnant, and she would give the child this name, Ptolemy 15 Caesar. But the people would know him by another name, Caesarion. Cleopatra did not announce to Rome that she had borne Caesar's child. But all the temples in Alexandria were opened for him. Cleopatra now had both a throne and an heir. In 46 BC, Julius Caesar returned to Rome and brought Cleopatra with him. But this was not a migration, it was a display. Cleopatra entered Rome with gold-embroidered ships, thousands of servants, and exotic animals. The Roman people welcomed her like a sorceress from the east. But the Senate was uneasy. Because Caesar was married, and he was bringing another woman before the people's eyes and hosting her like a goddess. Cleopatra lived in a villa in Rome. She was with Caesar, but unrest was growing among the people and the Senate. On one hand, in Rome, Cleopatra enchanted Caesar. Whispers spread. On the other hand, rumors that Caesarion could be the heir to the Roman throne created fear. And in the end, a man in Rome began to sharpen his dagger. The year was 44 BC. It was March, and the day was the Ides of March. While Cleopatra was waking up in her villa in Rome, Julius Caesar was preparing to go to the Senate. One last look, one last word, one last touch of the hand. At that moment, neither of them knew this was the last look. But as Caesar walked to the Capitol, whispers rose behind him. Those waiting for him were not friends but enemies. In the middle of the Senate hall, 23 daggers plunged into Julius Caesar's body. When Brutus, one of the men he trusted most, delivered the final blow, Caesar only said, "You too, Brutus." When the news reached Cleopatra, everything froze. Caesar was dead. She was a foreign queen, unprotected in the midst of Rome. After Caesar's death, chaos began in Rome. The Senate turned on itself. Caesar's allies fled. The people marched to his house, and Cleopatra's name began to be whispered as a scapegoat. The Eastern sorceress came. She bewitched Caesar. Because of her, Rome is in chaos. Cleopatra was no longer tolerated. Because after Caesar's death, Caesarion's inheritance was opened for discussion. Cleopatra knew that if she stayed in Rome, she would lose Caesarion. The Roman people saw him as Caesar's illegitimate child, and his claim to the throne meant a threat to Octavian. Cleopatra had to make a choice. Either she would stay in Rome and continue to play for power, or she would return to Egypt and stay away from Rome. And Cleopatra chose the latter. Cleopatra took Caesarion with her. She boarded her gold-embroidered ships and left Rome. But this was not a triumphant return. It was a march of defeat. She had neither Caesar nor Rome's protection by her side. Now everything had to start over. But there was a difference. Cleopatra was no longer just a queen. She was the only surviving legacy of a dead emperor. When she returned to Egypt, the people welcomed her. But the palace was silent. The walls were strong, but Cleopatra was broken. She decided to raise her son like a god. Caesarion's face resembled Caesar's, and as she watched him every day, Cleopatra whispered, "Your destiny will be greater than his." Meanwhile, another man was rising in Rome. Octavian. His name was mentioned in Caesar's will. He was very young but determined, and in his eyes, Cleopatra was not Caesar's memory. She was a threat. Roman-Egyptian relations were now remembered not with love but with suspicion, and Cleopatra began to search for a new ally. And one day, one of Rome's powerful generals, Marcus Antonius, approached the shores of Egypt. Cleopatra knew this man's power, influence, and passion. But there was one thing she did not know. This man would fall in love with her. After Caesar's death, a power vacuum had emerged in Rome. This vacuum was filled by three men: Octavian, Caesar's adopted son; Marcus Antonius, Caesar's most loyal general; Lepidus, Rome's old politician. This trio was called the Second Triumvirate, but one of them was looking towards the east. Marcus Antonius was tasked with governing the east of Rome and had turned his eyes to Egypt, because Egypt meant wealth, army, and strategic location. But there, waiting for him was not just land but a woman. In 41 BC, Marcus Antonius summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus. But Cleopatra came not like a ruler, but like a goddess. Her ship was covered in gold. She herself was in the costumes of the goddess Isis. The scent of sandalwood spread to the harbor. Music, dancers, incense. The people of Tarsus were looking at a woman while looking at the sky. Marcus Antonius raised his head, and the moment he saw Cleopatra, the direction of history changed. Antonius initially approached with political calculations, but Cleopatra did not only know politics. She knew how to unravel souls as well. They complemented each other. Antonius was the sword. Cleopatra was the mind. He was strength. She was grace. One represented Rome, the other the Nile. A passionate bond formed between them. They quickly became an inseparable couple, and this relationship was now not just a love. It was an alliance. Marcus Antonius settled in Alexandria with Cleopatra. Here, they formed a special entertainment group called the Inimitable Livers in the palace. Cleopatra and Antonius organized entertainments day and night. But behind these entertainments was a great strategy, so that the Egyptian people would not fear Rome, so that Roman soldiers would recognize Cleopatra as queen, and so that Cleopatra's children would carry the legacy of both Rome and Egypt in the future. 3 children were born from the union of Cleopatra and Marcus Antonius: Alexander Helios, sun's son; Cleopatra Selene, Moon's daughter; and Ptolemy Philadelphus. These children were not just royal babies. They were the continuation of an ideology, an empire. And Cleopatra wanted to build a future with each of them. But Rome did not just look at entertainment. Octavian began to see this union as a threat, because Cleopatra was no longer just a queen. She was a ruler who had bound Rome's most powerful commander to herself. This sentence echoed in the Senate. Marcus Antonius has become the slave of an Egyptian woman, not Rome. This rumor gradually turned from gossip into a call to war. Cleopatra declared Marcus Antonius not just a lover but a king. She gave lands to her children: Phoenicia, Syria, Cyprus, Palestine, Libya, and this proclamation was made to all peoples. The Empress of the East is Cleopatra. This was the last straw for Octavian, because Rome was being challenged, and this time, not words but armies would speak. In the Alexandria palace, Cleopatra was not just raising her children. She was building an empire. She had introduced her son Caesarion as the only true heir of Caesar. Together with Marcus Antonius, she had declared her children rulers of lands. This was unacceptable to Rome, because Caesar's official heir was Octavian. But Caesarion's birth could make his claim to sovereignty illegal. Octavian presented this situation as a threat to Rome's existence. He addressed the Senate thus: "An Egyptian woman is trying to take over Rome." And the name of the war was now clear: East against West, Cleopatra against Rome. Octavian revealed Antonius's secret will in Rome. According to this will, Antonius was leaving his assets in Rome to Egypt. He recognized Caesarion as Caesar's only son. He supported his accession to the Roman throne. This declaration angered the Roman people. Now war seemed not only inevitable but legitimate. Octavian prepared a large navy. While Marcus Antonius was preparing for war against Rome, Cleopatra also mobilized the Egyptian navy. 2 armies, 2 loves, 2 throne claims, and 1 collision point. Actium. The year was 31 BC. Off the coast of Greece at Actium, a naval battle that would determine the fate of history was about to begin. Cleopatra was not just a supporter. She was a leader physically present in the war. She was at the head of her navy with her own ships. The war was not only Marcus Antonius's but also Cleopatra's war to protect her queenship. But Octavian's navy was faster, more organized, and when that moment came, Cleopatra made the most difficult decision in the world. In the middle of the battle, Cleopatra gave the order to her own navy to retreat. Antonius followed her. The battle ended with Octavian's victory. In Rome, it was said, the Egyptian woman fled in the middle of the battle. Antonius, loyal to his love, followed her, and Rome prevailed. But the truth was not that simple. Cleopatra realized at that moment that the battle would be lost. She had retreated to save her navy. But this move shook the confidence among Antonius's commanders and sealed his fate. After Actium, Cleopatra and Marcus Antonius retreated to Alexandria. But now Rome was approaching. The Egyptian people were in panic, and even the palace walls were silent. Cleopatra felt the empire she had built for years collapsing. But she was still standing. Because she could lose a war but would not give up her honor. Cleopatra prayed alone in the temple of Isis. She whispered like the last words of a civilization, not a woman, "If this is to be an end, let it be written in my tongue, closed with my hands." The Battle of Actium had been lost. Octavian had won. But Cleopatra was still alive and still on a throne. The air in Egypt was now not cool but cold. The footsteps of Roman soldiers could be heard in the streets of Alexandria. Marketplaces fell silent, prayers in temples came out trembling. The people wondered if Cleopatra, the goddess of the Egyptians, was truly divine. Because goddesses did not collapse. But this city was collapsing. After Actium, Antonius became isolated. He carried the burden of the war and the shame of defeat on his shoulders. His soldiers abandoned him. His generals surrendered to Rome. He now remained only in Cleopatra's palace in Alexandria. His eyes empty, his voice trembling, his decision lost. One morning when he woke up, he looked at the palace walls and whispered, "I was once Rome. Now I am just the shadow of a woman." The Roman armies were coming down the Nile Valley. Octavian entered Egypt and sent a message to Cleopatra. "Surrender. Give me your son. Step down from your throne." This was not just an offer, it was a threat. Because if Cleopatra did not surrender, Caesarion would be killed, and Egypt would be officially occupied as a province of Rome. When Cleopatra heard Octavian's offer, she played one last game. She had her spies in the palace whisper that Antonius was dead. The reason for this is still debated. Either she wanted to prepare him for death or test his final loyalty. But when the news arrived, Marcus Antonius's heart stopped. He was a warrior man, but he was defeated by his love, and before Cleopatra's eyes, he plunged his sword into his stomach. His last words, "Cleopatra, I loved you as much as Rome, but Rome did not forgive me." Cleopatra held him in her arms, touched his blood, and cried silently. Dozens of years of strategies, armies, diplomatic moves were all now buried in a man's body. The Alexandria palace was now silent. Antonius's body was consecrated to the gods, but Cleopatra was still alive, and Octavian was still at the door. Octavian finally captured Cleopatra in her palace but did not kill her, because she needed to stay alive. It was planned to display her in a triumph parade in Rome, to see a queen chained in the streets of Rome. For Octavian, this was the symbol of victory, but Cleopatra's plan was different. "If Rome is to see me standing, it must see me only as a legend." Cleopatra was now a captive, not in the Alexandria palace, but in a special room under Octavian's control. Rome's plan was clear. Cleopatra would survive. She would be taken to Rome and exhibited in chains during a triumph parade. This woman, once seen as Isis, would now be a shattered symbol before the people. But Cleopatra could never allow this, because she was not just a woman. She was Egypt itself. Cleopatra persuaded her guards. She conveyed her last wish. She wanted to be buried next to Antonius's body. This request was approved by Octavian, because he still wanted her alive. For the triumph, for the show. But Cleopatra used this permission for something else. To die. There is a legend in Egypt. True queens face death not with a sword but with scorpion venom. Cleopatra, a poisonous cobra hidden in a secret compartment in the fruit basket brought to her. Or perhaps a scorpion. She made her final preparations. She put on her white linen dress. She wore her golden bracelets. She whispered her prayers dedicated to Isis, and then placed the poisonous animal under her left breast. One bite, one tremor, and then eternity. When Cleopatra's servants found her lying on the ground, there was peace on her face. When Octavian entered, he realized his victory was incomplete. Because you can chain a woman, but you can never chain her will. Cleopatra had written her own end. This was the most silent but strongest blow dealt to Rome. Her son Caesarion was her heir, the only child believed to have come from Caesar's blood. After Cleopatra's death, Roman soldiers found him too and killed him. Thus, not only a woman ended, a lineage, a belief, a civilization also ended. 30 BC. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt was officially annexed to the Roman Empire. Never again was there an Egyptian pharaoh. The gods fell silent. The pyramids remained in shadow. Even the Nile began to flow more quietly. After Cleopatra's death in 30 BC, Marcus Antonius, Caesarion, and Cleopatra's 3 children were all erased from history. Some were killed, some exiled. Rome was now completely in Octavian's hands, and he was now not just a man but an emperor. He ascended the throne with the title of the first Roman emperor. His new name was Augustus, and Augustus banned Cleopatra's name in Rome. He tried to erase her from history, because in everyone's memory, this sentence still remained: an Egyptian woman brought Rome to its knees. Alexandria was now a province connected to Rome. The Library of Alexandria, once the science center of the world, was emptied. Temples were closed. The palaces on the banks of the Nile were buried in silence. The palace where Cleopatra lived gradually disappeared. Even today, her palace has not been fully found, because Egypt had now become the country of history, not kings. In temples, Latin writings were seen. On statues, Roman clothing. On coins, figures of Caesar. The Library of Alexandria, once the world's greatest knowledge center, was neglected during the Roman period. According to some sources, it was damaged during war. According to others, it was deliberately dismantled. Whatever happened, now tax records were kept there, not science. In Alexandria, tax officials roamed instead of philosophers. By the middle of the 1st century AD, a new faith spread throughout the Roman Empire. Christianity also reached the lands of Egypt. Especially Alexandria became one of the important centers of this new religion in the East, and over time, the gods of Egypt began to be forgotten. Thoth was forgotten. Osiris was made to be forgotten. Isis temples were converted into churches. When Christianity was officially accepted in the 3rd century AD, the last pagan priests in Egypt had to abandon their temples. The Serapeum was the largest Isis temple in Alexandria. During the Roman Christian transition, this temple suffered iconoclastic attacks. That is, every statue symbolizing the gods was broken. Ancient Egypt officially spiritually passed into history. When the Roman Empire split in two, Egypt became part of the Byzantine Empire. In 641 AD, Arab armies entered Egypt. The commander of Caliph Umar, Amr ibn al-As, conquered Alexandria, and now Egypt entered a new period, the Islamic period. For 1,000 years, the pyramids remained just mysterious structures. No one knew why or how they were built. Hieroglyphs could not be deciphered. The Egyptian language was forgotten. The gods were made to be forgotten, and Cleopatra's name lived only in whispers. Ancient Egypt still breathes. In the shadow of the pyramids, in the silence of Isis, in the name of Cleopatra. Because some civilizations do not collapse. They only hide. Some women are unforgettable. They only wait to be retold.